Section 1. The Silence After the Storm. August 15th, 1945. A small, unnamed island in the Marianas chain. The air was a thick, wet blanket, heavy with the scent of crushed vegetation, damp earth, and the lingering metallic tang of conflict. For Sergeant Kenji Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Army, the world had shrunk to this sweltering pocket of jungle, a world defined by the gnawing emptiness in his stomach and the profound exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. The fighting had ceased not with a grand climactic roar, but with a whimper, an eerie silence that felt louder and more unsettling than the cacophony of battle it had replaced. The constant symphony of machine gun fire, the percussive crump of mortars, and the sharp crack of rifles had faded, leaving behind only the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. For weeks, this noise had been their reality, a shield against thought, a brutal rhythm to which they had moved, fought, and endured. Now, its absence was a void, and into that void rushed the thoughts he had held at bay for so long. He sat with his back against the damp bark of a banyan tree, his Arisaka rifle resting across his lap. It was heavy, impossibly so, not just with the weight of wood and steel, but with the weight of duty, of expectation, of a promise made to an emperor he had never seen. His uniform, once a symbol of immense pride, was now a collection of rags, stained with mud and sweat, torn by shrapnel and thorns. He looked at the handful of men who remained with him, his platoon reduced to a ghostly echo of its former self. They were hollow-eyed specters, their faces gaunt, their movements slow and deliberate, as if conserving the last vestiges of their energy. They had fought with a ferocity born of absolute conviction, a belief that their spirit, their Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material disadvantage. They had believed in the divine wind that would sweep their enemies from the sea. They had believed in the sanctity of their cause and the ultimate, unquestionable victory of their nation. But belief was not a shield against the endless waves of men and machines that had crashed upon their shores. Belief could not replenish ammunition that had long since been spent, nor could it fill bellies that had been empty for days. They had eaten roots, leaves, anything the jungle offered that wasn't poisonous. They had sipped condensation from broad leaves in the early morning, their throats parched. And they had fought. They fought until their machine guns fell silent, their mortars ran dry, and they were left with rifles and a handful of cartridges each. Then, they fought with bayonets, and now, there was nothing left to fight with. The silence was broken by a voice from the trees, a voice amplified by a strange, metallic device. It was speaking their language, but the accent was foreign, the cadence unnatural. It spoke of the Emperor's broadcast. It spoke of an end to the hostilities. It spoke of surrender. The word itself was poison. Surrender. Horyo. A prisoner. In all their training and all the stories of valor and honor, this was the one outcome that was never considered. It was a fate worse than any other, a stain upon one's family, one's ancestors, one's very soul. The code was simple, absolute. You do not surrender. You fight until the end, and if capture is imminent, you choose a final, honorable act. You do not allow yourself to become a tool of the enemy, a source of shame for your nation. Kenji looked at the faces of his men. He saw confusion, disbelief, and a profound, bottomless despair. They were warriors without a war, soldiers whose purpose had been extinguished in a single broadcast from a faraway land. The American voice droned on, promising fair treatment, promising food and water. It was a lie, of course, it had to be. They knew what to expect from their enemies. They had been shown the caricatures, heard the stories. The Americans were barbarians, undisciplined and cruel. They would inflict unspeakable tortures. They would humiliate them. They would desecrate their bodies and their spirits. This was the known truth, the foundation of their will to resist. The promise of humane treatment was merely a trick, a lure to draw them out from their final redoubt. One of the younger soldiers, a boy from a fishing village in Kyushu, began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking. He was no more than 18, his face still holding the softness of youth beneath the grime and exhaustion. Kenji felt a pang of something, not pity, but a shared communal agony. They were all adrift in a sea of disgrace. He tightened his grip on his rifle. The cool metal was a familiar comfort. He thought of his family, of his father's stern but proud face when he had left for the front. He had sworn he would not bring shame upon their name. And now, this. The amplified voice gave instructions to lay down their weapons, to walk towards the beach with their hands held high. It was an impossible choice. To obey the voice was to accept dishonor. To disobey was to... what? To wait in the jungle until starvation claimed them? To make a final, futile charge against an unseen enemy? A gesture that would go unwitnessed and unremembered. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows through the jungle canopy. The air grew cooler, but the humidity remained, clinging to their skin. Kenji knew a decision had to be made. He was the ranking soldier. The lives and the honor of these few men were in his hands. He looked at his rifle, then at the haggard faces around him. He saw not soldiers, but men. Men who were fathers, sons, and brothers. Men who had dreamed of returning home to fields of rice and the laughter of children. The warrior's code was a beautiful, terrible thing. It demanded everything. But what did it offer them now, in this suffocating silence at the end of the world? Slowly, deliberately, he placed his rifle on the ground. The sound was small, a soft thud on the damp earth, but it echoed with the finality of a temple bell. One by one, the other men followed his lead, their movements stiff and reluctant. With hands that felt strangely light and empty, they raised them above their heads. They emerged from the tree line, blinking in the fading light. The beach was a vista of alien power. Landing craft sat like great steel beasts in the shallows. Men in green uniforms moved with a casual efficiency, their numbers overwhelming. They were larger than Kenji had imagined, their faces unreadable. As the small group of Japanese soldiers shuffled forward, they braced themselves for the inevitable. They expected shouts, blows, the butt of a rifle. They expected the savage cruelty they had been taught was the American way. Instead, they were met with a strange, unnervating quiet. The American soldiers who approached them did so with a caution that seemed almost professional. Their weapons were ready, but not aimed with overt aggression. A young officer with tired eyes and a sunburned nose gave a series of quiet commands. Hands patted them down, searching for hidden weapons with a detached thoroughness. There were no taunts, no jeers, no brutality. They were simply processed. The initial shock of this unexpected professionalism was disorienting. It was the first crack in the foundation of their worldview, the first hint that the world they had been prepared for was not the world they were now entering. They were herded towards a collection point, their bare feet sinking into the cool sand. Kenji risked a glance back at the jungle, the dark, menacing wall of green that had been his home and his battlefield. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he had stepped out of his own body, out of his own life, and was now watching a strange play unfold. He was Kenji Tanaka, a soldier of the Emperor. But as he stood on that beach, surrounded by his captors, stripped of his weapon and his purpose, he had no idea who he was supposed to be now. The sun finally disappeared below the waves, and the first stars began to appear in the velvet sky. For the first time in a very long time, Kenji knew he would survive the night. He did not yet know whether that was a blessing or a curse. Section 2. The First Offering. The hours immediately following their surrender passed in a disorienting haze for Sergeant Kenji Tanaka and his men. They were marched from the beach to a makeshift holding area, a wide clearing surrounded by concertina wire that glinted under the harsh, artificial glare of portable floodlights. The generators hummed with a low, constant drone, a sound of industrial power that was as alien to the jungle as the men who had brought it. Kenji expected the true nature of his captors to reveal itself here, away from the initial, more public encounter on the beach. This was the place for interrogation, for humiliation, for the cruelty he knew was coming. He kept his back straight, his expression a carefully constructed mask of impassivity, determined to show no fear. He would not give them the satisfaction. He would uphold the honor of a Japanese soldier even in the disgrace of captivity. The men were made to sit in rows on the ground, a silent, exhausted assembly of ghosts in tattered uniforms. American guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements relaxed but watchful. Kenji studied them, searching for any sign of the barbarism he had been warned about. He saw young men, some looking barely older than the boy from Kyushu who sat beside him. He saw weariness in their eyes, the same bone-deep fatigue that he felt himself. They chewed gum. They spoke to each other in low tones. They smoked cigarettes, the tips glowing like fireflies in the tropical darkness. They seemed not like monsters, but simply like other soldiers at the end of a long and difficult campaign. This observation did not bring comfort. It only deepened his confusion. The world was supposed to be divided into the noble and the barbaric, the righteous and the demonic. This mundane reality of tired young men doing a job was not in the script he had been given. A new group of Americans entered the enclosure. One was an officer, identifiable by the insignia on his collar, and with him were several medics, their helmets marked with a red cross on a white circle. A ripple of fear passed through the Japanese prisoners. The medics were often said to be the most cruel, using their knowledge of the human body to inflict maximum suffering. Kenji braced himself. The officer, through a Nisei interpreter whose Japanese was fluent but carried the unmistakable accent of someone raised on foreign soil, explained that they would all be given a medical examination. The interpreter's presence was another jolt. To see a person of Japanese descent wearing an American uniform, speaking on behalf of the enemy, was a profound and unsettling contradiction. He was a symbol of a world more complex than Kenji had ever imagined. The prisoners were told to line up. The process was slow, methodical. As each man stepped forward, a medic would look him over. They checked for shrapnel wounds, for signs of jungle infections, for the telltale lethargy of malaria. Kenji watched as one of his men, whose leg had been badly gashed by a piece of shrapnel days ago, was examined. The wound was foul, and the soldier, Corporal Ito, winced as the medic gently probed it. Kenji expected the medic to be rough, to cause pain for his own amusement. Instead, the American spoke softly, his words translated by the interpreter. He was telling Ito that the wound was badly infected and needed to be cleaned. Ito was led away, not towards a dark tent for interrogation, but towards a brightly lit medical station where other medics were working. He was given a place to sit, and they began to carefully clean and dress his wound. Kenji could not comprehend it. Why would they waste precious medical supplies on an enemy? Why would they show such care to a man they had been trying to eliminate just hours before? It made no tactical sense. It was a violation of the brutal logic of war. Then came the first offering, a gesture so simple, so fundamental, that it struck Kenji with the force of a physical blow. American soldiers began moving down the rows of prisoners, carrying large metal canteens. They offered water to each man. Kenji's throat was a desert. He hadn't had a clean, full drink of water in weeks, surviving on sips of collected rainwater and the moisture from chewed roots. The instinct to accept was overwhelming, a primal scream from his dehydrated body. But his mind resisted. Was it poisoned? Was it a trick? A final, cruel joke to be played on the defeated? He watched as the man next to him, weak with thirst, hesitated for a moment before nodding. The American guard unscrewed the cap and tilted the canteen, pouring a stream of clear, cool water into the prisoner's cupped hands. The man drank greedily, water spilling down his chin and onto the tattered remains of his uniform. The guard waited patiently until he was finished, then moved to the next man. There was no malice in his expression, no hint of contempt. It was an act of simple, uncomplicated humanity. When the guard reached Kenji, he instinctively shook his head. He would not accept anything from them. He would resist in the only way he had left. The guard paused, looked at Kenji's cracked lips and sunken eyes, then simply shrugged and moved on. Kenji felt a strange mix of pride and regret as he watched the canteen pass. His pride was the familiar armor of his training, but the regret was a new and unwelcome sensation. His body cried out for what his spirit had just refused. Shortly after the water, another group of soldiers arrived, this time with crates of tinned rations. The smell of food, something other than the bitter taste of jungle plants, filled the air. It was a scent of salt and fat and substance that made his stomach ache with a hollow, desperate cramp. Tins were opened and handed out, along with small metal spoons. Kenji was given a tin of what the interpreter called pork and beans. He stared at it, the strange, brown mush a mystery to him. This was the food of his enemies. To eat it felt like another form of surrender, a betrayal of his own people who were starving under the blockade back home. Yet, all around him, his men were eating. Their initial hesitation was quickly overcome by the raw, undeniable power of hunger. They ate slowly at first, as if unsure, then with a quiet, desperate intensity. The sounds of spoons scraping against metal filled the enclosure. Kenji's resolve began to crumble. The aroma of the food was a form of torture, more effective than any physical threat. The hunger was not just an emptiness. It was a physical pain, a clawing beast inside him. He thought of the warrior's code, of fasting and enduring hardship. But that was for the purpose of strengthening the spirit for battle. The battle was over. What was the purpose of this self-inflicted torment now? He looked down at the tin in his hands. He was a prisoner. His fate was no longer his own. Refusing to eat would not change that. It would only weaken him, making him less able to face whatever came next. With a sense of profound resignation, he dipped the spoon into the beans and brought it to his mouth. The taste was foreign, overly sweet and salty, but it was food. It was substance. It filled a void that had been carved out by weeks of deprivation. As he ate, he felt a wave of shame wash over him, but it was followed by something else, a deep, undeniable sense of relief. He was eating, he was drinking, he was alive. The Americans were not just keeping them alive, they were actively nourishing them. This was not the behavior of barbarians. It was the behavior of... He didn't have a word for it. It was methodical, organized, and strangely humane. He finished the tin and placed it on the ground beside him. The immediate gnawing pain in his stomach subsided, replaced by a feeling of warmth. He looked around at his men. Some were already asleep, their bodies finally succumbing to exhaustion now that the immediate threat of combat was gone and their bellies were full. Others sat quietly, their faces illuminated by the stark floodlights, lost in their own thoughts. The initial shock of surrender was beginning to give way to a more complex and unsettling reality. They had been prepared for a brutal end. They had been prepared for honor in death. They had not been prepared for this. They had not been prepared for water, for medicine, for food. They had not been prepared for a kindness that felt more disarming than any weapon, a humanity that threatened to dismantle their entire understanding of the enemy, of the war, and of themselves. In the sterile light of the holding pen, surrounded by the humming of generators, Kenji felt a chilling premonition. The struggle for the island was over, but a new, more bewildering battle was just beginning. The battle for his soul. Section 3. The Voyage into Limbo. 2 days later, under the relentless gaze of the tropical sun, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka and the other prisoners were marched from the wire enclosure down to the shore. A large transport ship, painted a dull, functional gray, waited for them in the deeper water, its sheer size a testament to the industrial might that had overwhelmed them. They were ferried out to it on smaller landing craft, the engines roaring as they slapped against the waves. The short journey across the turquoise water was a passage from one world to another. The island, with its familiar landscape of battle and survival, receded behind them, shrinking until it was just another green smudge on the horizon. Ahead lay the gray wall of the ship, a floating piece of the enemy's world, a vessel that would carry them into an unknown future. The process of boarding was efficient and impersonal. They were directed up a steep gangway, their bare feet unsteady on the metal treads. On deck, they were counted, recounted, and then herded down a series of narrow ladders into the cavernous belly of the ship. The air below deck was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, paint, and hundreds of unwashed bodies. It was hot, and the only light came from bare bulbs encased in wire cages. They found themselves in a vast cargo hold, a space designed for machines and crates, not for men. Simple tiered bunks had been welded to the bulkheads, creating a cramped metallic hive. This, Kenji thought, is where the true hardship begins. On this long voyage, crammed together in the dark, the Americans' thin veneer of professionalism would surely peel away, revealing the cruelty beneath. They would be starved, beaten, left to suffer in the suffocating heat. The voyage itself would be the punishment. He found a bunk in a corner, as far away from the central hatch as possible, and sat down, pulling his knees to his chest. He felt a profound sense of powerlessness, a man adrift not just on the ocean but in his own fate. The ship's engines rumbled to life, a deep, vibrating tremor that resonated through the steel deck and up into his bones. The ship was moving. They were leaving their war behind. Life in the hold quickly settled into a monotonous, disorienting routine, punctuated by the changing shifts of the guards and the delivery of meals. There was no day or night in their windowless world, only the perpetual twilight of the bare bulbs. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept. Yet, the anticipated brutality never materialized. The guards who patrolled the catwalks above were not overtly hostile. They were watchful. Yes, their presence a constant reminder of their status as captives. But they did not engage in random acts of cruelty. Their orders were simple: maintain order, prevent escape. They did so with a kind of bored detachment. The first few days, Kenji and his men were tense, expecting the worst at any moment. Every footstep on the metal stairs, every shouted command from above, sent a jolt of anxiety through the hold. But the blows never came. The anticipated torments remained ghosts of their own expectation. The food, while bland and repetitive, was consistent. Twice a day, mess crews would lower buckets of rice, a thin vegetable stew, and sometimes a kind of salted fish. It was not the food of a proud warrior, but it was sustenance. It kept them alive. It kept them strong. More shocking than the food was the water. Large barrels of fresh water were always available, and no man was ever denied a drink. To Kenji, who had seen men become delirious from thirst in the jungle, this casual abundance of the most essential element of life was a miracle and a mystery. Why this largesse? Why this expenditure of resources on defeated enemies? He began to observe his captors more closely. The young men who stood guard were not the one-dimensional demons of propaganda. They were simply men. He watched them during their long, boring shifts. He saw them lean against the railings, their faces etched with a homesickness he recognized. He saw them reading letters from home, their expressions softening for a moment before they tucked the precious paper back into a pocket. He saw them share cigarettes and quiet jokes. One guard, a tall, lanky boy with red hair, would sometimes hum quietly to himself, a simple, melancholic tune that drifted down into the hold. In that simple act, Kenji did not see a monster. He saw a farmer's son, or a shopkeeper's boy, who missed his home just as much as Kenji missed his own. This growing realization was deeply unsettling. It was easier to fight a demon than a man. It was easier to hate a caricature than a person who hummed a sad song on a lonely night watch. His own men were changing too. The rigid military discipline that had defined their lives began to fray in the enforced idleness of the hold. Without officers to command them, without a battle to fight, without a purpose to strive for, they were becoming individuals again. They talked, not of strategy or duty, but of their homes, their families, their lives before the war. Kenji learned that Sergeant Major Sato, a man he had known only as a fearsome and unyielding warrior, was a skilled carpenter who dreamed of building a new house for his wife. He learned that Private Kondo, the quiet radio operator, was a poet who could recite classical verses from memory. These were the parts of themselves they had buried in order to become soldiers. Now, in this floating prison, those buried selves were beginning to re-emerge. Kenji remained mostly silent, an observer. He was still a sergeant, and he felt the weight of his rank, the responsibility to maintain some semblance of order and morale. But he was also undergoing his own internal transformation. The rigid certainties of his world had been shattered, and he was left to piece together a new understanding from the confusing fragments of his experience. The code of Bushido had taught him that life was secondary to duty and honor. A warrior's purpose was to die for the emperor. But here he was, alive. He had not chosen an honorable end. He had surrendered. And now he was being kept alive by the very people he was supposed to have died fighting. The shame of this was a constant, dull ache in his chest. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, a new, more terrifying thought began to take root in his mind. What if the code was wrong? Or not wrong, but incomplete? What if there was more to life, and to honor, than a glorious death on the battlefield? What if surviving, even in disgrace, held its own kind of purpose, its own kind of duty? The thought was blasphemous, a betrayal of everything he had ever been taught. He tried to push it away, to cling to the familiar pillars of his old beliefs. But the evidence of his own eyes was a powerful counterargument. The simple, humane treatment he was receiving, the mundane humanity of his guards, the reawakening of the men around him, it all pointed to a world that was far more complex and nuanced than the stark, black and white picture that had been painted for him. One afternoon, a small group of prisoners was taken up to the main deck for an hour. Kenji was among them. After weeks in the dim, stale air of the hold, the sudden explosion of sunlight and fresh, salt-laced air was a physical shock. He shielded his eyes, blinking against the brilliance. The ocean was immense, a vast, endless expanse of deep blue under a clear sky. There was no land in sight. They were truly in a limbo, a space between their past and their future. He saw American sailors going about their tasks on deck, swabbing floors, coiling ropes, maintaining the machinery of the great ship. They paid the prisoners little mind, their focus on their work. There was no audience for their captivity, no one to perform their defiance for. They were simply cargo. As he stood at the railing, feeling the sun on his face and the wind in his hair, Kenji felt a strange sense of detachment. He was no longer Sergeant Tanaka, warrior of the Emperor. He was not yet a prisoner in a foreign land. He was simply a man on a ship in the middle of a great ocean, suspended between a life that was over and another that had not yet begun. The journey was stripping him down to his essential self, forcing him to confront the man who existed beneath the uniform and the ideology. He did not know who that man was, or what he was supposed to believe in anymore. All he knew was that the ship was moving forward, and he was moving with it, into the heart of the unknown. Section 4. The Shore of a Different World. After what felt like an eternity, a change occurred in the rhythm of the ship. The steady thrum of the engines altered its pitch, and a new, subtle motion, a gentle rolling, suggested they were leaving the open ocean and entering calmer, coastal waters. A ripple of anticipation and anxiety spread through the hold. Their journey was ending. Soon they would discover what new reality awaited them. The order came to prepare to disembark. They were herded up from the dark confines of the hold, ladder by ladder, until they emerged, blinking and disoriented, onto the sun-drenched main deck. The light was blinding, and the air was cool and crisp, a startling contrast to the humid, tropical heat they had left behind. But it was the view that struck them all into a stunned silence. They had arrived. Before them lay a city, a sprawling metropolis unlike anything Kenji had ever seen. It rose from the shores of a vast, sparkling bay, a landscape of towering buildings that scraped at the sky, their windows glinting in the morning sun. A magnificent, rust-colored bridge spanned the water, a feat of engineering so grand it seemed to defy the laws of nature. This was America. Kenji's mind struggled to process the scene. The propaganda had spoken of an enemy on the verge of collapse, a decadent and weak society crippled by the war. But this city showed no signs of struggle. There were no bombed-out buildings, no columns of smoke, no visible scars of conflict. It was whole, vibrant, and immense. Countless ships, both naval and civilian, moved through the bay with an air of bustling purpose. On the shore, automobiles, more than he had ever seen in his life, moved in orderly streams along wide, paved roads. It was a vision of breathtaking power and prosperity. This single view did more to dismantle the myths of the war than any lecture or argument ever could. They had been told they were fighting a desperate, cornered foe. The reality, spread before him in a stunning panoramic display, was that they had been fighting a titan, a nation of such wealth and industrial capacity that it could wage a war on the other side of the world and leave its own homeland untouched and thriving. A profound sense of futility washed over him. How could their small, resource-poor island nation ever have hoped to prevail against this? The sheer scale of it was demoralizing. As they were marched down the gangway onto the solid ground of the pier, Kenji felt a new kind of intimidation. It was not the fear of physical harm, but the overwhelming psychological weight of being in the heart of the enemy's power. They were surrounded by civilians who stopped to watch the procession of ragged prisoners. Kenji expected jeers, insults, perhaps even thrown objects. He steeled himself for the hatred of a people whose sons they had been fighting. Instead, he saw curiosity. He saw faces that were unreadable, some showing pity, others a detached interest. But he saw no overt malice. They were a spectacle, a piece of the distant, exotic war brought home. The lack of open hostility was, in its own way, more unnerving than hatred would have been. It spoke of a confidence, a certainty of victory so absolute that they, the defeated enemy, were not even worthy of passionate scorn. From the port, they were loaded onto buses with blacked-out windows. They could not see where they were going, but they could feel the smooth ride of the vehicle on well-maintained roads. After a short drive, they were transferred to a train. It was not a cattle car, as he might have expected, but a passenger train with simple wooden seats, Guards were posted at the end of each car, but the prisoners were allowed to sit freely. The train began to move, pulling away from the city and into the countryside. Through the windows, a new and astonishing landscape unfolded. They passed through verdant valleys, past vast, orderly farms that stretched to the horizon, their fields cultivated with a mechanical precision Kenji had never witnessed. They saw small towns with neat wooden houses, each with its own green lawn. They saw children playing, women hanging laundry, life continuing with a placid normality that felt like a dream. The country was immense. For days, the train traveled eastward, and the scenery was a constantly changing tapestry of mountains, plains, and forests. The sheer emptiness and size of the land was staggering. In Japan, every patch of arable land was precious, meticulously cultivated. Here, vast tracts of wilderness seemed to stretch on forever, unused and untouched. It was a land of unbelievable abundance. This journey was a crucial part of their psychological reorientation. It was a silent, powerful lesson in the true nature of their adversary. The soldiers on the islands had been a mere projection of this nation's power. The source of that power was this endless, wealthy, and peaceful land. It was a nation that had not been forced to turn its schools into factories or its parks into vegetable gardens. The war, for the people they saw from the train window, was a distant affair. A headline in a newspaper, a son or husband in a faraway place. It was not a daily struggle for survival against firebombs and starvation. Kenji spent hours just staring out the window, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The pride he had once felt in his own nation's spirit and endurance now seemed fragile, almost naive, when set against the material reality of America. He felt a deep sorrow for his own people, for the sacrifices they had made in a cause that now seemed so hopeless from the start. During the journey, he spoke for the first time with the Nisei interpreter who had been with them since the island. The man's name was Corporal Jimmy Endo. He was young, perhaps 20, and had been born and raised in California. His parents were from Hiroshima. Jimmy approached Kenji, offering him a cigarette. Kenji, after a moment's hesitation, accepted. "Big country," Jimmy said in Japanese, gesturing towards the window. Kenji nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "It's a long way to Wisconsin," Jimmy continued. "That's where the camp is." Camp McCoy. The name meant nothing to Kenji. It was just a point on an incomprehensible map. "Why?" Kenji finally asked, the question encompassing everything he did not understand. "Why are you treating us this way? The food? The train? Why?" Jimmy took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out slowly. "Geneva Convention," he said, using the English words. He then translated. "There are rules, international laws for how to treat prisoners of war. America follows them." Kenji had heard of such things, but they had been dismissed as signs of Western weakness, foolish sentimentality in the face of total war. To see those rules put into practice was bewildering. "And because," Jimmy added, his voice quieter, "my commanding officer believes it's the right thing to do. He says how we treat our enemies shows who we are." This simple statement struck Kenji with incredible force. It was a philosophy of strength, not weakness. It suggested that true power was not just the ability to vanquish an enemy, but the discipline to show restraint and adhere to a code of conduct even in victory. It was a different kind of code from his own, one based not on the glory of death, but on the preservation of a certain kind of dignity, both for the victor and the vanquished. The train rattled on, carrying him deeper into the heart of a nation he was beginning to see not as a demonic entity, but as a complex and powerful human society. The physical journey across the vast continent mirrored his own internal journey across a landscape of shattered beliefs and emerging questions. He was traveling towards a place called Camp McCoy, but his true destination was a new understanding of the world and his place within it. The shore he had landed on was not just a physical place. It was the edge of a whole new reality. Section 5. The Ritual of Cleansing. The train journey ended in a landscape that was utterly alien to Sergeant Kenji Tanaka. They had arrived in Wisconsin. The air was cool and dry, a stark contrast to the humid Pacific, and the terrain was a gentle roll of farmland and deep green forests of pine and birch. The sky seemed whiter and paler here. After disembarking at a small, rural station, they were loaded onto military trucks for the final leg of their journey. The trucks rumbled down a country road, passing neat farms with large red barns, before turning onto a gravel road that led to the camp. Camp McCoy was not a grim fortress of stone and iron. It was a sprawling, orderly city of simple wooden buildings, laid out in a precise grid and surrounded by high wire fences with guard towers at the corners. It was vast, clean, and organized. It looked less like a prison and more like a massive Spartan army base. As the trucks rolled to a stop inside the main gate, Kenji felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was it. The journey was over. The transit, with its strange, detached humanity, was finished. Here, in the permanent camp, the true nature of their captivity would be revealed. He and the other prisoners were ordered out of the trucks and lined up in neat rows on a parade ground. A new set of American soldiers took charge, their uniforms crisp, their bearing professional. An officer stood before them, a stern-looking man with a clipboard, and through an interpreter, he laid out the rules of the camp. The speech was not about punishment or revenge. It was about regulations. There were rules for wake-up, for mealtimes, for work details, for lights out. It was a speech about order and discipline. After the briefing, the first stage of their processing began. This was the moment Kenji had been steeling himself for. He expected to be stripped, shorn, and subjected to humiliating inspections. He expected to be treated like an animal. The reality was both exactly what he feared and completely different in its intent. They were led into a long, low building. The interior was steamy and smelled strongly of soap and disinfectant. It was a delousing station and bathhouse. They were ordered to remove all of their clothing. Kenji folded his ragged uniform, the last physical link to his former life, and placed it on a wooden bench. Standing there, exposed and vulnerable with his fellow soldiers, he felt a profound wave of shame. This was the ultimate degradation for a warrior. A group of American medics in white coats directed the process. They were firm, but not cruel. Their attitude was clinical, as if they were processing livestock. But there was no mockery in their eyes, no taunts on their lips. Each prisoner was dusted from head to toe with a white antiseptic powder from a pressurized can. The powder was cold against his skin, and the process was impersonal and efficient. Kenji clenched his fists, his jaw tight, enduring the indignity in stoic silence. He was a number, a specimen being cleansed of the filth of the battlefield. This, he thought, was the beginning of the dehumanization. But then came the next step, and it was here that his entire framework of expectation was shattered. They were not herded into a cold, filthy room. They were led into a large tiled chamber lined with shower heads. A soldier turned a series of valves, and from the nozzles overhead sprayed streams of hot, steaming water. Hot water. It was a luxury Kenji had not experienced in years. The simple, shocking pleasure of it was overwhelming. The heat soaked into his weary muscles, washing away not just the physical grime of the journey and the jungle, but also some of a deep, internal chill. For a moment, he forgot he was a prisoner. He was just a man under a stream of hot water, a man feeling a simple, profound creature comfort. He watched the dirt and dust of the Pacific Islands swirl away down the drain, and it felt as if years of hardship were being washed away with it. They were given bars of soap, another unimaginable luxury. The clean, sharp scent of the soap was a revelation. He scrubbed his skin, his hair, feeling more human with every passing second. He looked at the faces of his men. The hard, stoic masks they had worn since their capture were gone, replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated relief. Some men closed their eyes, letting the water run over their faces. Others laughed, a sound that was rusty and unfamiliar. In that shower room, they were not soldiers, not prisoners, not victors or vanquished. They were just men, sharing in a simple, universal ritual of cleansing. After the showers, they were given clean towels and led to an adjoining room. There, piled on tables, were stacks of new clothes. Not prison stripes, not humiliating rags, but simple, functional military-style fatigues. They were made of a sturdy blue denim fabric, clean and stiff. There were undergarments, socks, and even sturdy work boots. Kenji picked up a shirt. The fabric was rough but strong. He put it on. It was a strange and powerful sensation, to be clothed in clean, whole cloth after years of wearing little more than decaying rags. The uniform was not Japanese. It was not American. It was a neutral garment, the uniform of a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. But it was clean. It was a mark of a new status. They were no longer remnants of a defeated army, but officially recognized prisoners, subject to a system of rules and regulations that, however bewildering, included the provision of clean clothing and hot showers. Dressed in his new blue uniform, Kenji looked at himself, then at the other men. They were transformed. The gaunt, spectral figures from the jungle had been replaced by a group of men who looked, if not proud, then at least dignified. The simple act of providing them with hygiene and clean clothes had done more than prevent disease. It had restored a measure of their personhood. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, but one so subtle and unexpected that Kenji could not yet grasp its full meaning. Brutality was easy to understand and resist. It affirmed one's own righteousness and the enemy's evil. This systematic, impersonal, and humane treatment was far more disorienting. It did not invite resistance. It invited confusion. It chipped away at the foundations of hatred and replaced it with a bewildering sense of cognitive dissonance. As he walked out of the processing building and into the clean, cool air of the Wisconsin afternoon, Kenji Tanaka felt a sense of profound dislocation. He had been prepared for a fight for his honor against cruel captors. He had been prepared to endure pain and humiliation. He had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared for the enemy to treat him not as a beast to be broken, but as a man to be cleaned. This simple, powerful act of providing a hot shower and a clean uniform was not an act of kindness in the way a friend would show it. It was an act of policy, of adherence to a code, and in its own way, that was even more powerful. It suggested a system, a philosophy, that was completely alien to his own. The battle he had anticipated was not going to be fought with fists and weapons, but with soap, delousing powder, and clean blue denim. It was a battle for his mind, and he had just lost the opening round without a single shot being fired. Section 6. The Architecture of a New Life. In the weeks that followed their arrival and processing at Camp McCoy, Sergeant Kenji Tanaka and his fellow prisoners were assimilated into a routine that was as rigid and predictable as any military schedule, yet utterly different in its purpose and nature. Their new life was defined not by the chaos of combat, but by the unyielding structure of camp administration, a structure built on the principles of the Geneva Convention. A document that Kenji was beginning to understand was not a suggestion, but a blueprint. The architecture of their existence was the camp itself. The barracks were long, single-story wooden buildings, unadorned and functional. Inside, rows of metal cots with thin mattresses and 2 gray blankets. Each were lined up with geometric precision. A single pot-bellied stove stood in the center for heat, against the surprising chill of the Wisconsin nights. It was not luxurious, but it was clean, dry, and secure. Compared to a foxhole filled with mud and rainwater, it was a palace. Each morning began not with the threat of an enemy attack, but with the sound of a bugle, a mournful metallic call that echoed across the vast compound. The prisoners would rise, make their beds in the prescribed military fashion, and tidy the barracks for morning inspection. The American guards who conducted the inspections were sticklers for detail. A wrinkle in a blanket or a speck of dust on the floor would earn a sharp word. Kenji initially saw this as another form of harassment, a way to exert power through petty regulations. But he soon realized it was something else. The insistence on cleanliness and order was not about humiliation. It was about preventing the spread of disease and maintaining a baseline of discipline and morale. It was, he recognized with a jolt, the same reason his own officers had insisted on such standards in basic training. The purpose was health and order, not cruelty. After inspection came breakfast in the mess hall. This, too, was a revelation. The mess hall was a large, noisy building where prisoners lined up with metal trays to receive their meals. The food was simple, mass-produced, and often strange to the Japanese palate. Stewed tomatoes, oatmeal, baked beans. But it was always hot, plentiful, and nutritionally balanced. 3 times a day, every day, they received a full meal. For men who had been slowly starving for months, this consistent, predictable nourishment was a powerful psychological anchor. The constant, gnawing anxiety about their next meal, which had dominated their existence for so long, simply vanished. The physical effects were dramatic. Within a month, the gaunt, skeletal figures who had arrived at the camp began to fill out. The hollows in their cheeks disappeared, color returned to their skin, and the listless lethargy of malnutrition was replaced by a new energy. Their bodies were healing, and with that physical recovery came a subtle shift in their mental state. With the primal need for food satisfied, their minds were free to grapple with their new circumstances. The camp was a self-contained world. It had its own hospital, a place Kenji regarded with deep suspicion, until he saw it in action. Men who were ill with malaria, dysentery, or other tropical diseases were taken there and treated by American doctors and medics. They received medicine, clean beds, and professional care. The camp's medical staff fought to save the lives of their prisoners with the same dedication they would have shown for their own soldiers. This commitment to healing their enemies was perhaps the most confounding aspect of Kenji's experience. The logic of total war, as he understood it, was to eliminate the enemy. The logic of Camp McCoy seemed to be to preserve him, to provide a semblance of purpose, and to keep the large population of men from the corrosive effects of boredom. The prisoners were offered the opportunity to work. They could volunteer for details on the camp's farm, in the kitchens, in the laundry, or on maintenance crews. For their labor, they were paid a small wage in scrip, a special currency that could only be used at the camp canteen. The canteen was another surreal feature of their new life. It was a small store where they could buy items like extra soap, toothpaste, cigarettes, candy, and writing paper. The idea that a prisoner could work, earn money, and purchase small luxuries was utterly alien. Kenji, driven by a deep-seated need to be useful and a desire to overcome the shame of idleness, volunteered for the farm detail. The work was hard, physical labor under the vast Wisconsin sky. They tilled fields, planted crops, and tended to vegetables that would be used to feed the camp population, both prisoners and guards alike. Working the soil was familiar and grounding. It connected him to the life he had known before the army, to the rhythms of the seasons and the simple satisfaction of seeing things grow. He found a quiet dignity in the labor. He was contributing, producing something of value. His sweat was earning him his keep, and this helped to soothe the part of his soul that recoiled at the idea of accepting charity from his captors. The interactions with the American guards on the work details were also instructive. They were not overseers with whips, but foremen. They were armed, a constant reminder of the power dynamic, but their primary role was to supervise the work and ensure it was done correctly. Some of the guards were farmers themselves and would offer advice on planting techniques or how to deal with a particular pest. These small, human interactions, focused on a shared constructive task, slowly eroded the monolithic image of the enemy. They were farmers, talking to farmers, men of the soil, despite the uniforms that separated them. The camp also had a library. It was a small building with shelves of books in both English and Japanese. Kenji, who had always been a reader, found himself drawn to it during his free hours. He read Japanese novels he hadn't seen in years, stories that transported him back to his homeland and reminded him of the culture and beauty he had been fighting for. But he also found translated American books. He read stories about American history, about its founding principles of liberty and individual rights. He read novels that depicted the lives of ordinary Americans. The books opened a window into the mind of his enemy, and he found not the decadent, materialistic culture of the propaganda, but a complex, idealistic, and often self-critical society. The routine of life in Camp McCoy, the bugle calls, the inspections, the meals, the work, the free time, was a carefully constructed system. It was designed to maintain order and health for thousands of prisoners. But its effects were much deeper than that. It was a form of re-education, not through lectures and propaganda, but through lived experience. By treating them humanely, by providing for their needs, by giving them work and dignity, the Americans were systematically dismantling the prisoners' previous worldview. They were demonstrating their own system's values, not by what they said, but by what they did. Kenji came to realize that the camp was not just a place of confinement. It was a powerful and meticulously designed environment for psychological change. It was an architecture of control, but the tools were not fear and pain. The tools were predictability, sustenance, and a strange, impersonal respect for their basic humanity. And against these tools, the armor of his old convictions offered little defense. Section 7. The Bridge of Words. Months bled into a year. The sharp, vibrant green of the Wisconsin summer gave way to the spectacular, fiery colors of autumn, and then to the deep, silent white of a winter colder than anything Sergeant Kenji Tanaka had ever imagined. The prisoners learned to stoke the pot-bellied stoves in their barracks, to wrap their blankets tighter, and to watch the snow fall in thick, silent curtains outside their windows. The unchanging routine of the camp was a constant, but within that framework, a slow, subtle evolution was taking place. The most significant change began not with an order or a new regulation, but with conversation. The catalyst for this change was the small cadre of Nisei interpreters, men like Corporal Jimmy Endo. They were the bridge between the two utterly different worlds that coexisted within the wire fences of the camp. They moved between the American administration and the Japanese prisoner population, translating not just words but concepts, intentions, and cultural nuances. Initially, many of the prisoners, including Kenji, had viewed the Nisei with suspicion and contempt. They were traitors, men of Japanese blood who had sided with the enemy. They were a paradox that was difficult to reconcile. But as time went on, this simplistic view began to soften. The prisoners saw that the Nisei were often caught in a difficult position, trusted completely by neither side. The American officers saw them as essential, but fundamentally Japanese, while the prisoners saw them as fundamentally American. They walked a lonely path between two identities. Kenji's interactions with Jimmy Endo became more frequent. Jimmy would often seek him out during breaks in the work detail, or in the evenings, bringing him an American magazine or just sitting to talk. Jimmy was endlessly curious about life in Japan and about the mindset of the Japanese soldier. Kenji, in turn, found himself asking questions about America. He asked about the strange customs he observed among the guards, about American family life, about the political system that seemed so chaotic compared to Japan's rigid hierarchy. Jimmy answered patiently, without judgment. He explained the concept of a loyal opposition in politics, the idea that one could disagree with their government and still be a patriot, a notion that was completely foreign to Kenji. He explained the American obsession with individual success and personal freedom. In Japan, Kenji said one evening, as they sat on the steps of the barracks, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and orange. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. The group is everything. The individual is nothing. Here, Jimmy replied, they tell you to be the nail that sticks up. They tell you to reach as high as you can. It's a different way of thinking about the world. Through these conversations, Kenji began to see that the differences between their two cultures were not necessarily a matter of right and wrong, or superior and inferior, but of different histories, different philosophies, different ways of organizing a society. The American guards, too, began to emerge as individuals. The prisoners learned their names, their habits. There was Sergeant Miller, a tough but fair man who had been a policeman in Chicago and who ran his work details with strict efficiency. There was Private Gannon, a young farm boy from Iowa who was terribly homesick and who would sometimes show the Japanese prisoners pictures of his family and his prize-winning pig. One day, on the farm detail, a piece of equipment broke down. It was a complex piece of machinery, and none of the Americans present knew how to fix it. Sergeant Miller was about to send for a mechanic from the main base when one of the Japanese prisoners, a quiet, older man named Mr. Nomura, stepped forward. In Japan, Nomura had been a master mechanic for a large manufacturing company. Through Jimmy, he explained that he thought he could fix the machine. Miller was skeptical, but, seeing no other option, agreed to let him try. For the next hour, with a small crowd of American guards and Japanese prisoners watching, Nomura worked with a focused intensity. He disassembled the faulty part, identified the problem with a few deft movements, and then, using the simple tools available, fashioned a clever repair. When he was done, he reassembled the machine, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded to Sergeant Miller. Miller gave the order to start the machine. It sputtered once, then roared to life, running as smoothly as before. A spontaneous cheer went up from the Japanese prisoners. Sergeant Miller stared at Nomura for a long moment, a look of grudging respect on his face. He walked over, clapped the older man on the shoulder, and said a single word that needed no translation. "Thanks." That small moment did more to build a bridge of mutual respect than any official policy could have. It was a recognition of skill, of competence, of individual worth that transcended uniforms and nationalities. The prisoners were not just a faceless mass of defeated enemies. They were individuals with skills, knowledge, and pride in their work. The camp also began a voluntary education program. Classes in English, American history, and civics were offered. At first, only a few prisoners attended, mostly out of curiosity. But word spread that the classes were not propaganda sessions, but genuine attempts at education. Kenji, encouraged by Jimmy, decided to attend the English class. Learning the language of his captors felt like a strange and complicated act. It was both a form of submission and a tool of power. To understand their words was to understand their thoughts, to gain some small measure of agency in his own life. The classes were taught by a university professor who had volunteered for the duty. He was a kind, patient man who treated his students not as prisoners, but simply as students. He taught them the basics of grammar and vocabulary, and he encouraged them to speak, correcting their mistakes gently. As Kenji began to piece together simple sentences, he found he could communicate directly with the guards, without relying on an interpreter. He could ask a question, understand a command, even share a simple pleasantry about the weather. Each successful exchange was a small victory, a crack in the wall of silence that had separated him from his captors. The words were the building blocks of a new kind of understanding. They allowed for the simple, human connections that propaganda and prejudice had worked so hard to prevent. The bridge of words was being built. One sentence, one conversation, one shared moment of understanding at a time. It was a fragile structure, but it was strong enough to carry the weight of their shared humanity across the chasm of war. Kenji realized that the most profound transformation happening in the camp was not physical, but linguistic and intellectual. They were learning a new language, and in doing so, they were learning to see the world and themselves through a new lens. Section 8. The Tremor from a Distant World. The summer of 1945 arrived, bathing the Wisconsin landscape in a deep, lush green. For Sergeant Kenji Tanaka and the other long-term prisoners, it marked another full cycle of the seasons in captivity. The life of the camp, with its predictable rhythms, had become a form of normality. The initial shock and disorientation had long since faded, replaced by a kind of institutionalized acceptance. They worked, they ate, they slept, they learned. They were prisoners, but they were alive and healthy. A fate far better than the one they had been conditioned to expect. Yet, an undercurrent of tension began to permeate the camp. The news from the war in the Pacific, which trickled in through the guards' conversations and the occasional newspaper, was grim. The island-hopping campaign was moving ever closer to the Japanese mainland. The prisoners knew what this meant. An invasion of their homeland would be a cataclysm of unimaginable proportions. They pictured their families, their homes, their sacred soil being turned into a battlefield. The stoic calm they had cultivated in the camp began to fracture. Arguments broke out more frequently in the barracks. Men grew sullen and withdrawn. The war, which had become a distant abstraction, was suddenly immediate and personal again. They felt a profound sense of helplessness, trapped thousands of miles away while their nation faced its ultimate crisis. The American camp administration seemed to sense this shift in mood. The guards became more vigilant, the camp rules more strictly enforced. There was a subtle tightening of control, a reminder that for all the humane treatment, they were still on opposite sides of a brutal conflict. Then, in the second week of August, something changed. A strange, new energy buzzed through the camp. The American officers and guards walked with a new sense of purpose, gathering in small, hushed groups. They would look over at the Japanese prisoners with expressions that were no longer just watchful, but held a new, unreadable quality, a mixture of gravity and something that looked almost like pity. The prisoners knew something significant had happened. Rumors flew through the barracks, wild and contradictory. Had there been a great Japanese victory? Had the American invasion fleet been destroyed by a divine wind? Or had the Americans landed, and was Tokyo now in flames? The uncertainty was a form of torture. They were suspended in an information vacuum, left to imagine the best and fear the worst. The official announcement came on August 15th, a date that would be forever burned into Kenji's memory. All prisoners were ordered to assemble in the main parade ground. The camp commandant, a colonel Kenji had only seen from a distance, stood on a raised platform, flanked by his staff and the Nisei interpreters. The entire camp was silent, 1,000 men holding their breath. The commandant began to speak, his voice amplified by a crackling loudspeaker system. His words were translated, sentence by sentence, by a grim-faced Jimmy Endo. He spoke of a new weapon, a force of unprecedented and terrifying power that had been used against their country. He did not give details, but he spoke of a level of destruction that had compelled the emperor himself to intervene. And then came the words that stopped Kenji's heart. His Majesty, the Emperor, had broadcast a message to the Japanese people. He had accepted the terms of the Allied powers. He had ordered an end to all hostilities. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. A sound went through the assembled prisoners, a collective gasp of disbelief and anguish. For a moment, there was just stunned silence as 1,000 minds tried to process the impossible. Then, the silence was broken. A low moan began, then another, and soon the parade ground was filled with the sound of open, unrestrained grief. Men who had endured years of hardship without complaint, who had faced death with stoic resolve, now wept openly. They fell to their knees, their faces buried in their hands. They wailed with a sorrow that was primal and absolute. Their world had not just been defeated, it had been annihilated. Everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, the entire purpose of their sacrifice, had been erased. The divine nation could not be defeated. The emperor was a living god. This news was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual cataclysm. Kenji remained standing, frozen. He felt nothing. It was as if his capacity for emotion had been severed. The words echoed in his mind. The war was over, Japan had surrendered, but they had no meaning. He looked at the weeping men around him, at the American guards who stood watching with a quiet, respectful solemnity, at the pale, shaken face of Jimmy Endo. It was all a dream, a terrible nightmare from which he would soon awaken. In the days that followed, a heavy, suffocating pall of despair settled over the camp. The routines continued, the bugle calls, the work details, the meal times, but they were performed by hollow men, automatons going through the motions. The energy and purpose, even the simple camaraderie, were gone. Men stopped talking to one another, each locked in his own private world of shame and grief. The shame was the most powerful emotion. They had failed. They had not only failed to win, but they had failed to die. They had accepted surrender, and now lived in the comfort of a prison camp, while their nation lay in ruins. The dishonor was a physical weight, pressing down on them, stealing the air from their lungs. The camp authorities handled the situation with remarkable sensitivity. They knew they were sitting on a powder keg of grief and despair. The guards were instructed to be less confrontational, to give the prisoners space. The work details were made voluntary for a time. The camp psychiatrist, a man the prisoners had always eyed with suspicion, made himself available, and the Nisei interpreters spent long hours just sitting with men who needed to talk, to vent their sorrow and confusion. Kenji found himself unable to participate in the collective grief. His own shock was too deep, too personal. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, though he did not know by whom. By his military leaders? By fate? By the gods? He replayed the commandant's words in his mind, focusing on the phrase, "a new weapon." He tried to imagine a force so powerful that it could compel his nation to do the unthinkable. He thought of the industrial might he had witnessed on his journey across America, the endless farms, the towering cities. It was a nation that could create such a weapon. He sought out Jimmy Endo. He found him sitting alone by the wire fence, looking out at the Wisconsin woods. "What was it?" Kenji asked, his voice hoarse. "The weapon." Jimmy looked at him, his young face old with the knowledge he carried. "They called it an atomic bomb," he said quietly. "They say one of them destroyed an entire city. A tragedy that befell 2 cities, in fact." He named them. One of them was Hiroshima, Jimmy's ancestral home. Kenji saw the flicker of personal pain in the interpreter's eyes and felt a sudden, unexpected kinship. In that moment, they were not prisoner and guard, not Japanese and American. They were two men of Japanese heritage, grappling with a tragedy that was too vast to comprehend. The news of the surrender was not an end. It was a tremor from a distant world that had sent a shockwave through the camp, shattering the fragile peace they had constructed. It had plunged them into a new kind of limbo, a state of waiting for a future that was now utterly unknown and terrifying to contemplate. Their war was over, but their journey through the wilderness of defeat had just begun. Section 9. The School for a New Japan. In the wake of the surrender, the atmosphere at Camp McCoy transformed once again. The acute, soul-crushing grief of the initial days slowly gave way to a pervasive and anxious uncertainty. The prisoners were no longer soldiers of a nation at war. They were now citizens of a defeated country, waiting to be repatriated to a home they could no longer imagine. What would they return to? To rubble and starvation, to a society that would despise them as symbols of a failed war and the shame of surrender. The question of their future hung over the camp like a permanent gray cloud. The American administration, however, had a plan. The purpose of the POW camps shifted from simple wartime confinement to a new, more ambitious objective: re-education. The American government realized it would soon be sending hundreds of thousands of former soldiers back to a Japan that was on the brink of social and political collapse. They saw an opportunity and a necessity to plant the seeds of a new, democratic ideology in these men, hoping they would become a stabilizing force in the post-war reconstruction. The voluntary classes in English and American history were expanded into a more formal and comprehensive program. Attendance was not mandatory, but it was strongly encouraged. New subjects were introduced: economics, international law, the principles of democratic governance, and agricultural science. University professors, civic leaders, and agricultural experts were brought into the camp to lecture. For Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, this new phase of camp life was a lifeline. The intellectual engagement provided a much-needed distraction from the shame and despair that threatened to consume him. He enrolled in every class he could. He was driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened, not just the military defeat, but the vast ideological and economic gulf that had separated his nation from the United States. He wanted to understand the source of America's strength, a strength he now knew was not just military, but also social and political. In the civics class, he learned about the American system of government, with its separation of powers and its system of checks and balances. He was fascinated by the idea of a government that was accountable to its people, where leaders could be criticized and even removed from office without it being considered an act of treason. This was a stark contrast to the unquestioning obedience to authority that had been the bedrock of his own society. In the economics class, he learned about free market capitalism, about industrial production on a mass scale, and about the economic theories that had fueled America's prosperity. He began to see the war not just as a clash of armies, but as a collision of two vastly different economic systems. Japan's spirit-driven, resource-poor war machine had been no match for America's industrial behemoth. Perhaps the most impactful classes for many of the prisoners were those on modern agricultural techniques. The lecturers taught them about crop rotation, soil conservation, and the use of modern machinery. For the many men from rural backgrounds, this was practical, useful knowledge that they could take home. It was not abstract political theory. It was a tangible tool for rebuilding. It gave them a sense of hope, a vision of a future where they could help make their devastated homeland fertile and productive again. Of course, not everyone embraced the re-education program. A significant faction of hardline militarists within the prisoner population saw it as nothing more than enemy propaganda, a final attempt to poison their Japanese spirit. They openly mocked the men who attended the classes, calling them weak and disloyal. Tensions ran high in the barracks between this faction and those, like Kenji, who were eager to learn. The camp administration was aware of this dynamic and largely allowed the prisoners to police themselves, intervening only when arguments threatened to escalate into physical conflict. The Nisei interpreters played a crucial role during this period. They led discussion groups, helping to translate and explain complex democratic concepts in a way that was culturally relevant to the Japanese prisoners. Jimmy Endo, in his group, did not just lecture. He encouraged debate. He asked them to think critically about their own traditions, about the role of the military in Japanese society, and about the path that had led their nation to ruin. A democracy is not just about voting, Jimmy explained one evening. It's about being able to ask questions. It's about being responsible for your own government, not just blindly following orders. It's harder, it's messier. But the Americans believe it is stronger in the end. Kenji became an active participant in these discussions. He found his voice, articulating the doubts and questions that had been growing within him for months. He spoke of the humanity he had seen in his captors, the systemic efficiency of their logistics, and the immense power of their industrial base. He argued that to rebuild Japan, they could not simply return to the old ways. They had to learn from their defeat and from their enemies. His stance earned him the scorn of the hardliners, but also the respect of many others who were quietly grappling with the same questions. He was becoming a leader again, but of a very different kind. He was not leading men into battle, but guiding them through a difficult and confusing intellectual transition. The camp was no longer just a prison. It had become a university, a laboratory for a new Japan. The Americans were not forcing their ideology upon them with threats or coercion. Instead, they were presenting it as a logical alternative, a system that had proven its strength and resilience. They were arming their former enemies, not with weapons, but with ideas. As the snows of a second Wisconsin winter began to fall, Kenji looked around at the men studying in the library, at the animated debates in the discussion groups, at the farmers learning about new kinds of seeds. He realized the most important battle of the war, for him, was being fought right here, inside the wire fences of Camp McCoy. It was a battle for the future, a struggle to replace a failed ideology of glorious death with a new one of hope, reconstruction, and responsible citizenship. He did not know if it would work or what awaited them back home. But for the first time since hearing the news of the surrender, he felt a flicker of purpose. He was no longer just a defeated soldier. He was a student in the School for a New Japan. Section 10. The first step on new ground. The spring of 1946 arrived, and with it came the news they had all been waiting for. The repatriation process was beginning. The long limbo was finally coming to an end. A strange mix of excitement and apprehension filled the barracks of Camp McCoy. They were going home. But the home they had left years ago no longer existed. It had been replaced by something new and unknown, a country occupied by the very men who had been their jailers. The final weeks in the camp were a flurry of activity. They were issued new travel documents and given a final, thorough medical examination. The blue denim POW uniforms were taken back, and in their place, they were given surplus American Army uniforms, stripped of all insignia, and dyed a dark, neutral color. It was a practical gesture, providing them with sturdy clothes for the journey, but it was also deeply symbolic. They were leaving as men clothed by their former enemy, a final, tangible reminder of their defeat and their dependency. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka packed his few belongings: a handful of books from the camp library, a notebook filled with English vocabulary and notes on crop rotation, and a small, carved wooden bird given to him by Mr. Nomura, the mechanic. As he looked at these meager possessions, He realized they represented his entire education in this strange new world. They were the tools he would carry into his future. The journey back across the country was the reverse of the one that had brought them. Once again, they were put on a train. But this time, the mood was entirely different. The shock and awe of their first trip had been replaced by a quiet, contemplative mood. They looked out the windows, not with the eyes of defeated warriors, seeing the enemy's homeland for the first time, but with the eyes of students who had spent a year studying its character. They saw not just power, but a complex society with its own strengths and weaknesses. They understood the connection between the vast, fertile fields and the endless supply of food that had sustained them. They understood the link between the bustling factories they passed and the ships and weapons that had overwhelmed them. During the long train ride, Kenji spoke with many of his fellow prisoners. He found that their experiences had changed them in profound ways. A young man from a fishing village spoke excitedly about using new methods of engine maintenance he had learned from a guard. An older farmer from Hokkaido discussed the American crop rotation system, convinced it could help his village recover. They were not talking like defeated soldiers. They were talking like builders, like pioneers facing a difficult but not impossible task. They had been stripped of their military pride, but in its place, many had found a new, more practical sense of purpose. The hardliners were still among them, silent and sullen, clinging to the remnants of their shattered ideology. But they were a minority. The majority of the men had been transformed by their long, strange, and unexpectedly educational captivity. They arrived at a port in California, the same one where their journey had begun. This time, as they marched towards the waiting transport ship, they saw the city not with intimidation, but with a new understanding. They were no longer mystified by its power. They had been given a glimpse into the engine room that drove it. The voyage across the Pacific was long and filled with a tense, quiet anticipation. They spent hours on deck, staring eastward, searching the horizon for the first sight of their homeland. Kenji stood at the railing with Jimmy Endo, who was accompanying this first group of repatriates as an interpreter for the American authorities, who would process their return. "Are you scared?" Jimmy asked. "Yes," Kenji admitted without shame. "I don't know who I am anymore. I am not the soldier who left Japan, and I am not an American. I don't know if there will be a place for a man like me in the new Japan." "You have to make a place," Jimmy said softly. "Men like you are the ones who have to build it." "It's a great responsibility." When they finally saw the coast of Japan, a cheer went up, but it was a subdued, almost hesitant sound. As the ship drew closer to the port of Yokohama, a stunned silence fell over the men. The vibrant, bustling city Kenji remembered was gone. In its place was a flattened, scarred landscape of ruin. Skeletons of buildings stood starkly against the sky. Vast areas were nothing but rubble and ash. It was a scene of utter, breathtaking devastation, far worse than anything he had imagined. The scale of the destruction was absolute. This was the price of the war. This was what they had been fighting to prevent, and what their defeat had wrought. As they walked down the gangway, they stepped into a world of ghosts. The people on the docks were thin, dressed in shabby clothes, their faces etched with weariness and hunger. They looked at the returning soldiers, not with heroes' welcomes, but with a mixture of pity and resentment. These were the men who had lost the war, returning to a nation they had failed to protect. The processing on the Japanese side was chaotic but swift. They were given their final release papers and a small sum of money. And then, just like that, they were civilians. Kenji stood outside the gates of the repatriation center, a free man for the first time in over a year. The air smelled of dust and charcoal. He saw a child scavenging in a pile of rubble. The full weight of his nation's defeat, and his own responsibility within it, settled upon him. He felt the old shame rise within him, the instinct of the defeated warrior. But then, he felt the notebook in his pocket. He thought of the lectures on democracy, the discussions with Jimmy, the look of respect on Sergeant Miller's face when Mr. Nomura fixed the machine. He thought of the hot shower, the clean uniform, the 3 meals a day. He had been defeated, yes, but he had also been treated with a strange, systematic humanity. He had been kept alive, he had been educated, and he had been sent home. His captors had given him not just his life, but tools to build a new one. He did not yet know why, not fully. Perhaps it was policy, perhaps it was philosophy, perhaps it was just the strange and unpredictable nature of human beings. But he knew that it had changed him forever. He took a deep breath of the dusty air of his broken homeland. His past was over. His future was a field of rubble. But a field of rubble was also a place where you could begin to build. He took his first step, not as a disgraced soldier, but as a man with work to do. His journey home was over, but his journey to build a new Japan had just begun.